On a frozen mountain slope in the northern Ural Mountains, 9 experienced hikers made a decision that would haunt the world for over 60 years. It was February 1st, 1959. The temperature had dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Winds howled across the barren landscape known to the indigenous Mansi people as Kolat-Siakul, Dead Mountain. Inside a tent pitched on the mountainside, 9 young Soviets, students, engineers, a war veteran, prepared for sleep after a long day of trekking through the brutal winter wilderness. They had traveled hundreds of miles to reach this remote location following an expedition route classified as Category 3, the most difficult level in the Soviet mountaineering system. These weren't amateurs, they were experts, carefully selected for their experience and skill. But something happened that night. Something so terrifying, so incomprehensible, that it drove them from their shelter in absolute panic. They cut their way out of the tent from the inside, tearing through the fabric with knives, fleeing into the deadly cold wearing only underwear and socks. Some were barefoot. They left behind coats, boots, food, and everything they needed to survive. 1 mile down the mountain, searchers would later find their bodies. Some had died of hypothermia, frozen in poses suggesting they were trying to crawl back to the tent. But others had injuries that defied explanation. Crushed ribs with the force of a car crash, yet no external wounds, fractured skulls, missing body parts, and on some of their clothing, traces of radiation. The Soviet government investigated for 3 months before concluding that the hikers had died from what they called a compelling natural force. Then they sealed the case, classified the files, and closed the area to all expeditions for 3 years. No explanation, no answers, just 9 dead bodies and a mountain of questions. This is the story of the DYATLOV Pass incident, named after the expedition's young leader, Igor Dyatlov. It's a mystery that has spawned countless theories, avalanches, military experiments, secret weapons testing, even paranormal phenomena. Scientists have studied it, investigators have debated it, families have mourned it, and 65 years later, the truth remains elusive. What happened on Dead Mountain on that freezing February night? What could possibly scare 9 experienced mountaineers so completely that they would choose certain death from exposure over staying in their shelter? Let's go back to the beginning. Let's meet the people who walked into the wilderness and never returned. Because the only way to understand this mystery is to understand them, their expertise, their preparation, their journey. And then maybe we can begin to comprehend the horror that drove them into the frozen darkness. Our story begins in Sverdlovsk, the city today known as Yekaterinburg. On January 23, 1959, the leader of this expedition was a young man named Igor Alexeyevich DYATLOV, just 23 years old, a 5th-year student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute studying radio engineering. Igor was known among his peers as methodical, intelligent, and fearless. He had led multiple expeditions before and had earned the respect of every hiker who knew him. For this journey, Igor carefully assembled a team of 8 others. These weren't random volunteers. Each person was selected for their specific skills and experience. Let me introduce you to them, because their stories matter. These were real people with real lives, real families, real dreams. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22 years old, also studying radio engineering. Her friends called her Zina. She was known for her determination and courage. In photographs from before the expedition, she's always smiling, her eyes bright with the excitement of adventure. She had completed multiple difficult treks before and was considered one of the strongest hikers in the group. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20 years old, the youngest woman on the expedition, studying engineering economics. Lyuda, as everyone called her, was passionate about the outdoors. She kept a detailed diary of her adventures and had plans to lead her own expeditions after graduation. Her enthusiasm was infectious. Several members later said it was Lyuda who convinced them to join Igor's group. Yuri Nikolaevich Doroshenko, 21 years old, studying engineering and economics.
Yuri was known for his sense of humor and his ability to keep morale high even in difficult conditions. He and his best friend, the other Yuri in the group, had hiked together for years and were considered inseparable.
Georgy Alexeyevich Krivonishchenko, 23 years old, studying engineering. The second Yuri, though everyone called him Georgy to avoid confusion. What made Georgy's story particularly important is that he had worked at a nuclear facility. 2 years before this expedition, the Kyshtym disaster, a massive nuclear accident, had contaminated a huge area near Sverdlovsk. Georgy had been part of the cleanup crew. This detail would become crucial later, when investigators found radiation on the hikers' clothing.
Rustem Vladimirovich Slobodin, 23 years old, an engineering student who had a special connection to the expedition's equipment. 3 years earlier, Rustem had helped construct the very tent they would use on this journey, taking 2 standard Soviet tents and sewing them together to create one long, custom shelter. He knew every seam, every reinforcement. This detail makes what happened to the tent all the more disturbing. Nikolai Vladimirovich Thibault-Brignoles, 24 years old, whose unusual surname came from his French mother. Nikolai worked as an engineer and had extensive winter camping experience. He was considered one of the most technically skilled members of the group, particularly good at navigation and route planning. Alexander Sergeyevich Kolevatov, 24 years old, studying physics. Alexander was quiet, serious, and meticulous. He served as the group's amateur photographer and kept detailed notes about weather conditions and terrain. His observations would later provide crucial evidence about the expedition's final days. Semyon Alexandrovich Zolotaryov, 38 years old, the oldest member of the group by far. Semyon was a World War II veteran who had fought in the Soviet campaign against Japan. He had extensive survival experience and had joined the expedition at the last minute, replacing another hiker who had to drop out. Some researchers find his presence mysterious. Why would an experienced veteran twice the age of most team members want to join a student expedition? But those who knew him said he simply loved the mountains and jumped at any chance to climb. And finally, there was a 10th member, Yuri Yudin, 21 years old, studying engineering. Yuri would become the most important person in this story, not for what he did, but for what he didn't do. On January 28th, the second day of the trek, Yuri developed severe knee pain and joint problems. After consulting with Igor, the difficult decision was made. Yuri would turn back. The group photographed him one last time as he prepared to leave. In that photograph, Yuri stands with his friends, smiling, waving goodbye. The 9 others would continue into the mountains. Yuri Yudin would be the only member of the DYATLOV group to survive. That decision to turn back would save his life, but it would also haunt him for the next 54 years, until his death in 2013. In interviews later, Yuri said he never stopped wondering, what if he had continued? Would his presence have changed what happened? Could he have saved them? This was the DYATLOV group. 9 experienced, educated, capable people. They had decades of combined hiking experience. They knew the risks, they were prepared, and they were about to walk into something that would baffle investigators for generations. The expedition departed Sverdlovsk on January 23rd with high spirits and careful preparation. They took a train to Ivdel, a small mining town at the edge of the northern wilderness. The journey was long, but filled with laughter. Photographs from the train show them playing a mandolin, singing, hiding under seats to avoid paying fares, typical student behavior. One member had brought a flask of vodka. Another had packed salo, traditional white pork fat that provides intense calories in extreme cold. From Ivdel, they took a truck to Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement before entering true wilderness. Vizhai was a Khanty village where local hunters and loggers lived. It was the last place they would see other humans besides their own group. The villagers who saw them depart later remembered them as confident and well-equipped. Several locals warned them about the weather. A major storm was predicted, but the hikers weren't concerned. They had faced bad weather before. On January 27th, they began their trek on foot. The plan was ambitious. They would traverse approximately 190 miles through some of the most remote and dangerous terrain in the Soviet Union, eventually reaching Otorten Mountain. The route was designed to take 16 days, They planned to send a telegram to their sports club when they returned, expected around February 12th. The first few days went smoothly. Their route followed trails used by the Mansi people, the indigenous inhabitants of the region. The Mansi were expert hunters and trappers who knew these mountains intimately. Following their trails made navigation easier and provided some psychological comfort. These paths had been used safely for generations. The hikers kept detailed diaries and took dozens of photographs. These documents, recovered months later from their cameras and notebooks, provide a remarkable window into their journey. We can see them cutting trails through deep snow, with one person breaking the path while others follow. We can read about their daily routines, waking at dawn, eating breakfast, trekking for hours, stopping to make camp, cooking dinner, writing in their journals by firelight. The weather was brutal from the start. Temperatures ranged from -25 to -40 degrees Celsius. Snow was chest-deep in places. Wind speeds reached hurricane force, but nothing in their writings suggests fear or unusual concern. These conditions, while harsh, were expected for this route at this time of year. On January 29th, they saw signs that other humans had recently been in the area. They found ski tracks and markers left by Mansi hunters. One photograph shows a wooden sign with Mansi writing carved into it. In his diary, Igor wrote that they wondered what the signs meant. Were they territorial markers, warnings, directions? They would never know. That same evening was Yuri Doroshenko's 21st birthday. The group celebrated with extra food and joking around. In photographs from that night, they're all smiling, relaxed, enjoying themselves. Yuri Krivonoshenko is captured mid-laugh. Zina Kolmogorova is helping with the cooking. Lyudmila Dubinina is writing in her journal. These are the images we have of them truly at peace, unaware of what was coming. On January 31st, they made a significant decision. Due to deteriorating weather and low visibility, they had accidentally veered off course. Instead of continuing toward Otorten along the planned route, they found themselves on the eastern slopes of Kolatsyakul, Dead Mountain. The Mansi name should have been a warning, but the Russians either didn't know its meaning or didn't take it seriously.
Dead Mountain wasn't their destination, but Igor made a tactical choice. Rather than lose altitude and start the next day's climb from lower elevation, they would camp on this slope overnight. It would save time and energy. It was a reasonable decision, the kind experienced mountaineers make regularly. There was no way they could have known that this choice would be fatal.
On February 1st, approximately 5 p.m., they began setting up camp. Photographs show them cutting into the snow to create a flat platform for their tent. This was standard procedure. You dig out a shelf on the mountainside to prevent sliding during the night. Rustam, who had built the tent, supervised its assembly. Others unpacked sleeping bags and cooking equipment. The last photograph, taken while there was still daylight, shows the tent fully erected, with several members working around it. The sky is overcast. Snow is falling lightly. The scene looks cold but manageable, exactly what you'd expect at this elevation in February. As darkness fell, they cooked dinner and gathered inside the tent. They had enough time that evening to write a satirical newsletter they called Evening Otorten, filled with jokes about their journey and playful teasing of each other. One section mocked Zolotaryov for being old, another made fun of Alexander for his overly detailed weather notes. The tone throughout is light-hearted, humorous, relaxed. This is the last record we have of them, alive and happy. The newsletter was dated February 1st, 1959. Within hours, something would happen that would send all 9 of them fleeing into the frozen darkness, beginning a cascade of events that would end with all of them dead and the world left with more questions than answers. What happened next remains one of the greatest mysteries in modern history. Between approximately 11 p.m. on February 1st and 2 a.m. on February 2nd, something occurred inside or near that tent that triggered absolute terror. We know this because of what investigators found 3 weeks later. The tent was torn open from the inside, not ripped by wind, not crushed by falling snow, deliberately cut, multiple slashes through the heavy canvas fabric, made by knives, wielded by people inside the tent, cutting their way out in panic. Let me be clear about what this means.
The tent had a perfectly functional entrance, a flap that could be opened from inside in seconds, but they didn't use it. Instead, they took the time to pull out knives and slash through the fabric itself. This is not normal behavior. This is the action of people who believe that using the entrance is impossible or deadly.
What could make the entrance unusable? Several theories exist. Perhaps something was blocking it, snow, debris, or something else. Perhaps whatever scared them was near the entrance, making that exit too dangerous. Or perhaps they were so disoriented, so panicked, that they simply reacted without thinking, cutting through the nearest surface they could reach.
But here's what makes it even stranger. When the tent was finally discovered, the entrance was still clear. Nothing was blocking it. Whatever they feared wasn't physically preventing them from using the door. Which means they were afraid of something else. Something that made slashing through their only shelter seem like the better option.
And then they ran. Footprints in the snow told the story.
8 or 9 sets of tracks.
The exact number was disputed because some prints overlapped, leading down the slope toward the tree line. The tracks showed they initially moved in a relatively organized fashion, walking close together. This wasn't a mad scramble in random directions. For at least the first few hundred meters, they stayed as a group.
But their clothing told a different story. When investigators later examined those footprints carefully, they could determine what the fleeing hikers were wearing. Some wore only socks, others were barefoot. One person had a single boot on. Most were wearing only underwear or light clothing. In -40-degree temperatures, this detail is absolutely critical to understanding the mystery. These were experienced mountaineers. They knew beyond any doubt that running into a Siberian winter night without proper clothing was a death sentence. You don't survive more than 10 or 15 minutes in those conditions without serious protection. They knew this, and they did it anyway. What kind of threat makes people choose certain death over staying in a shelter? What could be so terrifying that freezing to death seems preferable? The footprints led nearly 1 mile down the mountain, all the way to the tree line where a forest of cedar and fir trees began. This wasn't a short sprint. This was a sustained flight covering significant distance. At some point during this descent, the group apparently split up or spread out because the tracks showed varying patterns. Some were deeper, suggesting running. Others showed a slower pace. When searchers followed these tracks 3 weeks later, they found no other footprints in the area. No boot prints from other people. No animal tracks. Nothing. Just the 9 sets of barefoot and sock-covered prints leading away from the tent into the wilderness. Whatever drove them away left no physical trace on the snow. Now here's another disturbing detail that often gets overlooked. The tent itself, while cut open, was still partially standing. If there had been a major avalanche, as some theories suggest, the tent would have been completely destroyed, buried under tons of snow. But it wasn't. The poles were still in position. Most of the contents were still inside, neatly arranged. Their supplies, their food, their coats, their boots, all still there. Inside the tent, investigators found a flask of vodka, barely touched. They found carefully folded clothing. They found personal items laid out as if the occupants had expected to return shortly. They found Evening Autorten, the satirical newsletter, suggesting the hikers had been relaxed enough to write jokes just hours before whatever happened. Near the tent, sticking out of the snow, they found a pair of skis and an ice axe. These items were standing upright, undisturbed. If a violent avalanche or snowslide had swept through the area, these lightweight items would have been carried away. What does all this tell us? Something happened that was sudden enough and terrifying enough to make 9 experienced hikers cut their way out of their only shelter and run into lethal cold. But whatever it was, it didn't leave obvious physical evidence. It didn't destroy the tent, it didn't leave footprints, it didn't scatter their equipment. For 3 weeks, nobody knew anything was wrong. The hikers had told their sports club to expect contact around February 12th. When that date came and went with no telegram, people began to worry. But even then, the initial response was measured. The Ural Mountains in winter are unpredictable.
Perhaps they were delayed by weather. Perhaps they were waiting out a storm somewhere. It wasn't until February 20th that a formal search and rescue operation was launched. By then, the trail was literally cold. The search party that set out on February 20th consisted of volunteer students from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, local Mansi hunters who knew the terrain, and eventually military personnel. The conditions were treacherous. Temperatures remained deadly cold. The search area was vast, thousands of square kilometers of mountainous wilderness covered in deep snow. One of the lead searchers was Mikhail Sharavin, a student at the same institute where Igor and most of the victims had studied. Years later, in interviews, Sharavin would describe the mounting dread he felt as they approached the area where the DYATLOV group should have been. They had expected to find the hikers alive, perhaps injured or delayed by weather. They had not expected what they were about to discover. On February 26th, 6 days after the search began, Sharavin and his team spotted something on a mountainside, a small patch of orange fabric, barely visible against the white snow. As they climbed closer, they realized what they were looking at, the DYATLOV group's tent. What they found there would haunt every person involved in the search for the rest of their lives. The tent was partially collapsed, with one end sagging into the snow, but it hadn't been destroyed. It was still recognizable, still mostly intact. Sharavin, who approached first, noticed something odd about the fabric. There were cuts, multiple cuts, long slashes through the heavy canvas. He called the others over. They began carefully examining the tent, afraid of what they might find inside. When they finally worked up the courage to look in, they found it empty of people, but everything else was still there. Sleeping bags still laid out as if someone had just climbed out of them. Personal items scattered but not destroyed. Food supplies, clothing, boots, multiple pairs of boots. This discovery immediately struck the searchers as wrong. If the hikers had left voluntarily, why hadn't they taken their boots? In Siberian winter, boots are second only to shelter for survival. No experienced hiker would voluntarily leave without them. But there they were, 9 pairs of boots still inside the tent. Then they noticed the cuts more carefully. Examining them from inside the tent, it became clear that these weren't made from outside. The fabric was pushed outward at the cut points. These were made from inside the tent by people inside who were cutting their way out. But why? The entrance was right there, easily accessible. Near the tent, searchers found tracks. Lots of tracks, all leading downhill toward the tree line. They began to follow them. The tracks were peculiar. Some appeared to be made by people wearing socks or even barefoot. This made no sense. Nobody goes outside in Siberian winter without boots. Nobody. The tracks led them down the mountainside, through deep snow, for almost a full mile. The search team followed, growing increasingly worried. If the hikers had traveled this far in inadequate clothing, they were almost certainly dead. There was no way to survive those temperatures for the time it would take to walk a mile down a mountain. They reached the tree line and a large cedar tree, and there, in the snow beneath the tree, they made their first horrifying discovery: 2 bodies. They were lying close together, both dressed only in underwear. The bodies were frozen solid. Later examination would reveal they were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, the 2 friends who had been inseparable in life, now dead together in the snow. But the scene told a story that was both heartbreaking and deeply strange. The cedar tree showed signs of someone climbing it. Branches were broken off up to about 12 to 15 feet above ground, broken recently based on the fresh wood visible at the breakpoints. Small twigs and needles were scattered around the base, and most crucially, there were burn marks in the snow, the remains of a small fire barely adequate, but clearly an attempt to create warmth. The 2 Yuris' hands were burned, not severely but noticeably. Their fingers showed signs of frostbite, but also burn marks consistent with handling burning wood or trying to maintain a fire while their hands were numb from cold. One of them, Krivonishenko, had bitten off a piece of his own knuckle. The medical examiner would later theorize he did this either trying to stay awake or to keep from crying out. This scene told a story. After fleeing the tent, at least
Some of the group had made it to this tree. They had attempted to build a fire. Someone had climbed the tree, possibly trying to see back toward the tent, possibly trying to break off dry branches for the fire. They had tried to survive, but ultimately the cold had won. The search party now knew for certain this was a tragedy. But where were the other 7? And what had driven these people from their shelter in the first place? The 2 bodies at the cedar tree raised as many questions as they answered. Why had they stayed here? Why not return to the tent once they had a fire going? What were they afraid of?
The search intensified. More volunteers arrived. The military brought in helicopters. Everyone knew that if 2 bodies had been found, there must be 7 more somewhere in the area. The race was on to find them before spring thaw made the terrain impassable.
Over the next few days, 3 more bodies were discovered, and each one added new layers to the mystery. These weren't found together like the 2 Uris at the cedar tree. Instead, they were spaced along the route back toward the tent, as if these hikers had been trying to return to their shelter but had died along the way. The first of these 3 was Zina Kolmogorova, found about 330 meters from the cedar tree. Zina's body was frozen in a position that suggested she had been crawling. Her hands were clenched. She was more fully dressed than the 2 at the cedar, wearing pants and a sweater, suggesting she had taken clothing from someone who had died before her. A grim but logical survival decision. But even with more clothing, she hadn't made it. Hypothermia had claimed her somewhere on that desperate crawl back toward the tent. When her body was examined later, doctors found a large bruise on her waist, approximately the width of a tree branch or baton. The bruise was severe enough to have caused significant pain, but it hadn't killed her. The official cause of death was listed as hypothermia. But that bruise raised questions. How had she gotten it? Had she fallen? Had she been struck by something? The bruise was too uniform, too specific to be from a simple fall. Approximately 180 meters further up the slope, searchers found the second body, Rustam Slobodin. Like Zina, Rustam appeared to have been trying to return to the tent. His position suggested he had been attempting to stand but had collapsed. He too was better dressed than the 2 Uris, wearing pants and a jacket, again suggesting he had either started with better clothing or had taken items from those who died first. But Rustam's injury was even more disturbing than Zina's bruise. He had a fracture to his temporal bone, the side of his skull. The fracture was relatively small, not immediately fatal, but significant enough to cause serious pain, disorientation, and likely impaired consciousness. How had he gotten it? The medical examiner noted that the fracture pattern was unusual, more consistent with pressure or a blow than with a typical fall injury. Finally, 330 meters further still, now only about 300 meters from the tent, searchers found Igor DYATLOV himself. The expedition leader had almost made it back. He was found face down in the snow, his arms positioned as if he had been trying to crawl. He wore more clothing than the others found so far, including a jacket and some kind of head covering. Like his friends, the official cause of death was hypothermia. But Igor also showed signs of internal trauma. He had been vomiting blood, evidence found in the snow around his body, and later confirmed during autopsy. His body showed bruising and abrasions, particularly on his hands and ankles. None of these injuries were fatal, but they told a story of someone who had been through significant physical trauma before succumbing to the cold. Now, the search party had found 5 bodies, all along a rough line from the cedar tree back toward the tent. The pattern seemed clear. After fleeing the tent and reaching the cedar tree, some members of the group had realized their mistake. Without proper clothing, without shelter, they would all die, so they attempted to return. 3 of them, Zina, Rustam and Igor, had tried to make it back. All 3 had died trying, spread across almost a full kilometer of mountainside. But this raised more questions. If they realized they needed to return to the tent, why didn't all 9 try together? Why did some stay at the cedar tree while others attempted the journey back? And what about the other 4 members of the group? Where were Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolovatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, and Semyon Zolotaryov? The search continued, now focusing on the area around the cedar tree and the ravine beyond it.
The snow was deep in places up to 4 meters, making the search incredibly difficult. Days turned into weeks. Despite intensive efforts, no trace of the remaining 4 hikers could be found. The snow was simply too deep, and the terrain too difficult.
By mid-March, with spring approaching and the snow beginning to melt slightly, search teams had to make a difficult decision. The site would soon become impassable due to ice breakup and flooding. They would have to suspend the search and resume when conditions improved.
But before leaving, investigators conducted extensive documentation of the tent site and the bodies that had been found. They catalogued every piece of evidence, took hundreds of photographs, and carefully mapped the locations of everything they had discovered. The tent itself was transported back to headquarters for detailed forensic examination.
Medical examiners performed autopsies on the 5 bodies. The initial findings were confusing. Yes, all 5 had died of hypothermia. But the injuries, the skull fracture, the bruises, the internal bleeding, these weren't consistent with simple exposure deaths. Something else had happened before the cold claimed them. And then there was the radiation. When investigators tested the clothing worn by Yuri Krivonischenko, they found elevated levels of radioactive contamination. Not enough to be immediately dangerous, but significantly above background levels. Where had this radiation come from? Was it related to Krivonischenko's previous work at the nuclear facility? Or was it evidence of something more sinister?
The case was officially categorized as a criminal investigation. The lead investigator, Lev Nikitich Ivanov, a senior prosecutor with decades of experience, took personal charge. He had handled many cases of death in the wilderness, but nothing like this. Every answer seemed to raise new questions.
While the search was suspended, waiting for spring thaw, the story of the DYATLOV group began to spread beyond the immediate region. Families had been notified. The deaths of 5 hikers, all students, all young, all died mysteriously on a mountain. This was news. Soviet newspapers, normally tightly controlled, ran brief reports about the tragedy. The families of the victims were devastated, but they were also confused and angry. The authorities had told them very little. How had their children died? What had happened on that mountain? Why had 9 experienced hikers fled their tent in deadly cold? The official explanation, death by hypothermia, felt inadequate, incomplete. Yuri Yudin, the lone survivor who had turned back before the incident, was interviewed extensively by investigators. The conversations were painful. Yudin described his friends, their planning, their expertise. He insisted repeatedly that this group knew what they were doing. They weren't reckless. They weren't unprepared. Something had happened that was beyond normal expedition risks. In one particularly emotional interview, Yudin broke down when discussing Igor Dyatlov. Igor was like a brother to me, he said. He was the most careful, most methodical person I knew. He would never make a mistake that would endanger the group. Never. Yudin's pain was compounded by survivors' guilt. Why had he turned back? Could he have prevented this if he'd stayed? Meanwhile, the investigation was encountering problems. Lev Ivanov, the lead prosecutor, was under pressure from multiple directions. The families wanted answers. The public wanted answers. But more troubling, Ivanov was receiving pressure from above, from regional Soviet authorities to close the case quickly. There were suggestions that dwelling on the deaths of 9 young people wasn't good for morale, that extended investigation would create unnecessary alarm. In interviews conducted decades later, after the Soviet Union had fallen and people felt freer to speak, Ivanov admitted that he and his team had been frustrated by these pressures. They knew there was more to discover. The missing 4 bodies, the radiation, the unusual injuries, all of this demanded further investigation, but they were being told to wrap things up. There was another factor, the rumors. In the weeks following the discovery of the first 5 bodies, stories began circulating in the region. Mansi hunters reported that other groups had seen strange lights in the sky near Dead Mountain around February 1st. Orange spheres, some said. Bright flashes. These reports weren't officially documented at first, dismissed as folklore or misidentification of natural phenomena, but then a remarkable piece of evidence emerged. Another hiking group, led by a man named Blinov, had been approximately 50 kilometers away from the Dyatlov group on the night of February 1st. Members of this group reported seeing strange lights in the direction of Dead Mountain, bright orange orbs moving across the sky. They had noted it in their expedition log. This was documented evidence, not just rumor. Additionally, workers at a weather station in the region reported similar observations. Bright lights, unusual colors in the sky on the night of February 1st and early morning of February 2nd. Some described them as resembling flares or signal rockets, but much brighter and lasting longer. When Ivanov's team investigated these reports, they found something even more intriguing. The Ural Mountains region was on a known flight path for R-7 intercontinental ballistic missiles being tested by the Soviet military.
Missiles launched from Baikonur Cosmodrome would fly over this region on their way to impact zones in the far north. Could there have been a missile test that night? Could the hikers have seen something they weren't supposed to see? This line of investigation was quickly shut down. Military authorities informed Ivanov that missile tests were classified information and were not relevant to his investigation. He was told, in no uncertain terms, to focus on natural explanations. The message was clear: don't suggest military involvement. For Ivanov, this created an impossible situation. He was a prosecutor, trained to follow evidence wherever it led, but he was also a Soviet official, expected to follow orders. The tension between these roles would define the rest of the investigation. Adding to the emotional complexity of the case were the family's increasing suspicions. When they were finally allowed to see their children's bodies, some family members reported disturbing observations. At the funerals, 5 separate funerals for the 5 recovered bodies, several relatives claimed the corpses had unusual coloration. One 12-year-old boy, attending his brother's funeral, later told investigators that the body had a strange orange-brown tan, as if it had been exposed to something unusual. Officially, this was explained as the normal discoloration of bodies that had been frozen for weeks. But the families weren't satisfied with this explanation. They began to suspect a cover-up. Rumors spread that the hikers had encountered something military, something secret, and that the government was hiding the truth. The pressure on Ivanov intensified. He needed answers, but he was being prevented from pursuing the most obvious leads. The military wouldn't cooperate. His superiors wanted the case closed. The families wanted truth. And somewhere on Dead Mountain, 4 more bodies lay beneath the snow, waiting to be found. What Ivanov didn't know yet was that when those 4 bodies were finally discovered, the mystery would deepen even further, and the evidence would be so disturbing that it would ensure this case would never be forgotten.
Spring arrived slowly in the Ural Mountains. By early April, snow began to melt, but the process was painfully gradual at high elevations. The search for the 4 missing hikers resumed in late April, though conditions remained difficult. Meltwater created streams and pools, making the terrain even more treacherous than winter snow. Investigators focused on the area around the cedar tree, particularly a ravine about 75 meters beyond where the 2 Uris had been found. This ravine was hidden, a natural depression that would have filled with many meters of snow during winter. If the missing 4 had sought shelter there, they might be buried deep. On May 4th, nearly 3 months after the initial incident, a discovery was made that would transform the DYATLOV Pass case from a tragic accident into one of the most disturbing mysteries in modern history. A local Mansi hunter named Ivan Pashin, searching with his dog, noticed something odd, a piece of brown fabric protruding from melting snow in the ravine. Closer examination revealed it was part of a sweater. They began carefully digging and found something that made them immediately call for investigators: human remains. Over the next several hours, searchers uncovered 4 bodies in the ravine, buried under approximately 4 meters of snow. They were found relatively close together, in and around what appeared to be a makeshift shelter. Cedar branches had been laid out on the ravine floor, forming a bed of sorts, a survival technique designed to insulate bodies from the frozen ground. The 4 victims were Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault Brignoles, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Lyudmila Dubinina. And immediately, searchers noticed something very different about these bodies compared to the first 5. These 4 were relatively well-dressed. They wore multiple layers, jackets, sweaters, pants, and some of their clothing had clearly belonged to the first victims. Lyudmila was wearing Yuri Krivonischenko's pants, cut up and wrapped around her feet for insulation. Semyon was wearing Lyudmila's hat and coat. This told a clear story. These 4 had survived longer than the others, long enough to make the heartbreaking decision to take clothing from their dead friends to try to stay alive. But when investigators examined the bodies more closely, they realized something was terribly wrong. These weren't simple hypothermia deaths. These bodies showed massive trauma. Nikolai Thibault Brignoles had catastrophic skull fractures. Not a simple crack, but devastating damage. The temporal bone on the side of his head was fractured in multiple places, with pieces of bone actually penetrating into the brain tissue. The medical examiner would later note that this injury alone would have been fatal, or at minimum would have caused immediate unconsciousness. Semyon Zolotaryov had severe chest trauma. 5 ribs on his right side were fractured in multiple places. 2 additional fractures on the left side. The term used in the autopsy report was flail chest, meaning the entire structure of his rib cage had collapsed. This is typically only seen in high-velocity impacts. Alexander Kolevatov had fewer injuries than the others, primarily hypothermia-related damage.
But there was an odd detail. His body had been found partially covering Lyudmila's, as if he had been trying to protect her or keep her warm. But it was Lyudmila Dubinina whose injuries were the most disturbing and would become the most famous aspect of this entire case. Lyudmila had massive chest trauma, 6 ribs fractured on her left side, 4 on her right. The force required to cause such damage was extraordinary. Her heart had been damaged by the broken ribs, massive internal hemorrhaging. And there was something else. Something that would become the source of countless theories and nightmares. Lyudmila was found missing her tongue. The entire tongue, removed at its root, along with the muscles of the floor of her mouth. Additionally, her eyes were missing, both of them, and part of her lips and facial tissue were gone. When the medical examiner, Boris Vozrojdeny, performed the autopsy on these 4 bodies on May 9th, he was shocked by what he found. In his official report, he stated that the force required to cause the chest injuries on Zolotaryov and Dubinina would have been equivalent to a car crash or being thrown from a moving vehicle at high speed. He specifically noted that such injuries could not have been caused by another human being. No one could hit hard enough to break ribs like this without leaving external wounds. Yet, there were almost no external wounds. No cuts, no abrasions on the chest corresponding to the broken ribs. Just internal devastation, as if they had been crushed by an enormous pressure applied evenly across their entire torso. The missing soft tissue, Dubinina's tongue, her eyes, parts of her face, and similar missing parts from Zolotaryov presented another mystery. Vozrojdeny initially noted these in his report, but didn't provide an explanation. Later theories would suggest scavenging animals, decomposition, or the fact that Dubinina's body had been found face down in a small stream. But at the time, with the body lying on his examination table, the missing parts created an almost horror movie atmosphere. Adding to the mystery, when clothing from these 4 bodies was tested, elevated levels of radiation were found on Dubinina's clothes, specifically the brown sweater she had been wearing, which had originally belonged to Krivonishchenko. The radiation levels were not dangerous to investigators handling the evidence, but they were significantly elevated above background levels. The discovery of the 4 bodies in the ravine created an immediate crisis for the investigation. The initial conclusion that the hikers had died of exposure after making some kind of navigation error was clearly inadequate. The injuries on these 4 victims demanded explanation, and simple hypothermia couldn't account for them. Lev Ivanov, the lead prosecutor, found himself in an impossible position. The evidence suggested something extraordinary, possibly violent, had occurred on Dead Mountain. But every avenue of investigation that might explain the evidence was being blocked by higher authorities. When Ivanov attempted to investigate the possibility of military testing in the area, he was stonewalled. Military records for that date and location were classified. He was told that no tests had occurred anywhere near the DYATLOV group's location. The reports of strange lights in the sky were dismissed as misidentification of natural phenomena, perhaps the aurora borealis, perhaps unusual weather effects. But Ivanov had personally interviewed multiple witnesses who saw these lights. These weren't confused villagers or superstitious Mansi hunters. Some witnesses were educated workers at weather stations, people trained in meteorological observation. They insisted they had seen something unusual, bright orange spheres, moving in ways that didn't match any natural phenomenon they recognized. In one particularly revealing interview conducted decades later, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, Ivanov admitted that he and his investigation team had personally seen strange lights while conducting their search in March. He described them as flying spheres that appeared over the mountain on multiple occasions. In his own words, "I saw them myself. We all did. They were real." But in 1959, Ivanov couldn't say this publicly. He couldn't include it in his official report. He was under orders to find a natural explanation and close the case. The pressure from above wasn't subtle. He was told explicitly that extended investigation would create panic, that suggesting military involvement would violate state secrets, and that the families needed closure. The pressure on Ivanov wasn't just professional, it became personal. His superiors questioned his competence. They suggested he was chasing fantasies. They reminded him that his career depended on closing this case satisfactorily. For a Soviet prosecutor in 1959, these weren't idle threats. Meanwhile, another subplot was developing, the mysterious past of Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest member of the group. Investigators began digging into his background more carefully.
Zolotaryov was 38, nearly twice the age of most other group members. He was a World War II veteran, with an unusual service record. He had served in the final months of the war, and had been decorated for bravery in combat against Japan. But there were gaps in Zolotaryov's documented history, periods where his whereabouts weren't clearly established. Some researchers would later wonder, was Zolotaryov what he claimed to be, a simple veteran who loved hiking, or was there more to his story? Could he have been working for Soviet intelligence? Was his presence on this expedition coincidence or design? This theory, that Zolotaryov might have been an intelligence agent monitoring the group or the area, has been proposed by multiple researchers over the years. It would explain his unexpected last-minute addition to the expedition. It might explain why he was carrying a camera, later found with his body, but no backpack or proper hiking gear. And it could explain the Soviet government's unusual interest in quickly closing the case. However, there's no concrete evidence for this theory. Zolotaryov's friends and fellow veterans insisted he was simply a man who loved the mountains. His addition to the expedition was last minute, because another hiker had dropped out, and Zolotaryov happened to be available and qualified. The camera he carried wasn't unusual. Several group members had cameras, and his lack of some equipment could simply be explained by joining at the last minute and making do with what was available. But in the context of a case already filled with mysteries, Zolotaryov's presence added another layer of questions, and some investigators couldn't help but notice, when his body was found, his camera was one of the few items he had with him. Why take a camera when fleeing in terror, but not take boots or a coat? Another subplot involved the radiation findings. The elevated levels found on some clothing items weren't high enough to have caused harm to the hikers, but they were high enough to demand explanation. Initial theories focused on Krivonischenko's and Kolevatov's previous work at nuclear facilities. Both men had been involved in activities near contaminated areas. Perhaps they had brought contaminated clothing on the expedition without realizing it, but skeptics pointed out problems with this theory. If the radiation came from previous contamination, why was it concentrated on specific items? Why weren't other pieces of their clothing similarly contaminated? And why did testing show the radiation present on Dubinina's clothes, which had belonged to Krivonischenko, but not on all of Krivonischenko's own clothing? Some researchers suggested the radiation might have come from external exposure during the night of the incident. If there had been some kind of weapons test, perhaps a failed missile that spread radioactive material, this could explain the patterns found. But without access to military records, this couldn't be confirmed or denied. The families of the victims, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly frustrated. They weren't being given full information. The autopsies were being conducted in secret. Details were being withheld. Several families hired their own lawyers, demanding answers.
By late May 1959, with all 9 bodies recovered and autopsies complete, Lev Ivanov faced a deadline. He needed to produce a final report. The investigation had to conclude, but how could he explain the evidence in a way that would satisfy both his superiors and the families of the victims? The evidence was contradictory and confusing. On one hand, 6 of the 9 deaths were clearly from hypothermia. The victims had frozen to death after fleeing their tent without proper clothing. This was indisputable, but the question of why they fled remained unanswered, and the injuries on 3 of the 4 ravine victims, the crushed chests, the skull fractures, these couldn't be explained by cold exposure alone. Ivanov's team considered multiple theories. Could there have been an avalanche? They investigated this thoroughly. The slope where the tent was pitched wasn't steep enough for a traditional avalanche, only about 15 to 20 degrees. Local Mansi people insisted they had never seen an avalanche in that location, and if there had been an avalanche strong enough to cause the injuries found on the ravine victims, it would have left obvious signs: disturbed snow patterns, destroyed vegetation, debris scattered over a wide area. None of these signs were present. Could the injuries have been caused by a fall? The ravine was deep enough that a fall might explain some trauma, but the medical examiner's reports were clear. The pattern of injuries wasn't consistent with falling. The broken ribs showed even compression across the entire chest, as if squeezed in a vice. The skull fractures showed similar patterns, pressure rather than impact. Could there have been an attack by the indigenous Mansi people? This theory was considered early on but quickly dismissed. First, there was absolutely no evidence of Mansi presence at the scene. No tracks, no physical evidence. Second, the Mansi had no motive. They had been friendly to previous expeditions. And third, as the medical examiner noted, the injuries on the ravine victims were beyond what any human could inflict. No one can hit hard enough to crush a ribcage without leaving external marks. Could there have been some kind of infighting among the group members? This theory suggested that perhaps the hikers had argued, fought, and some had attacked others. But this made no sense. Why would they all flee the tent together if they were fighting each other? Why were they found in positions suggesting cooperation, trying to build a fire together, sharing clothing? And again, the injuries couldn't be explained by interpersonal violence. The theory that kept emerging, whispered among investigators but never officially documented, was that something military had occurred, perhaps a test of some kind, perhaps an accident involving weapons or equipment. The strange lights reported by multiple witnesses, the elevated radiation, the massive trauma with no external wounds. Could
Could this be consistent with some kind of pressure wave or blast effect? But this theory led nowhere. Military authorities wouldn't cooperate, records were classified, and investigating further would have meant accusing the Soviet military of causing the deaths of 9 citizens, a career-ending, possibly life-threatening accusation in 9. He requested permission to conduct additional tests at the site. Specifically, he wanted to bring in equipment to measure radiation levels more thoroughly and to search for any physical evidence of weapons effects. His request was denied. He was told the case needed to close. In one of the most revealing moments of the entire investigation, Ivanov met privately with a senior regional official. According to Ivanov's later testimony, this official told him explicitly, "Find an explanation that doesn't involve the military, doesn't involve classified activities, and closes this case. The families will receive compensation. The case will be sealed." That's how this ends. Ivanov was devastated. He knew the conclusion he was being forced to reach was inadequate, but he also knew he had no choice. On May 28, 1959, he filed his final report. The conclusion: the 9 members of the DYATLOV hiking group died as a result of being caught in extreme weather conditions. 6 died of hypothermia. 3 died of injuries consistent with being caught in a compelling natural force, the exact phrase used in the report, which could have been a small avalanche or snowslide that occurred in the ravine. The report acknowledged that some questions remained unanswered but concluded that in the absence of evidence of criminal activity, the case should be closed due to the absence of a guilty party. This was a specific legal formula in Soviet law, essentially saying that while something bad had happened, no crime had been committed and no one could be charged. The investigation files were classified and moved to a secret archive. The area around Dead Mountain was officially closed to all hiking expeditions for the next 3 years. No explanation was given for this closure, though the official reason stated was to prevent future tragedies. The families received death certificates listing hypothermia as the cause of death for 6 victims and traumatic injury for 3. They received modest compensation, and they were told that the investigation was complete and no further information could be provided. But everyone involved knew this wasn't really an answer. It was an ending, but not a solution, and for Lev Ivanov, it was the beginning of a burden he would carry for the rest of his life.
The official closure of the case in May 1959 didn't end the story. It just pushed it underground. In the Soviet Union of the late 1950s and early 1960s, with strict control over information and media, most mysteries could be buried and forgotten. The Dyatlov Pass incident might have disappeared entirely from public consciousness if not for a few key individuals who refused to let it go. Yuri Yudin, the lone survivor, became the unofficial keeper of his friend's memory. For decades, he collected information, corresponded with investigators, and fought for more transparency about what had happened. In interviews throughout his life, Yudin always emphasized the same point. His friends were experts. They didn't make mistakes. Whatever happened to them wasn't the result of incompetence or poor judgment. Yudin made a critical decision in the early 1960s. He began secretly photographing and copying documents related to the case before they disappeared entirely into archives. Working through connections at the Polytechnical Institute and sympathetic investigators, he assembled a private collection of materials, photos, autopsy reports, maps, witness statements. This collection would prove invaluable decades later when researchers began investigating the case. One particularly important decision Yudin made was to organize annual memorial treks to the Dyatlov Pass site. Starting in the mid-1960s, once the area was reopened to hikers, Yudin led groups of friends, family members and interested parties to Dead Mountain. These weren't just memorial visits, they were investigations. Yudin photographed the terrain, tested theories about avalanches and weather patterns, and documented everything carefully. During one of these treks in 1967, Yudin made a disturbing discovery. The tent, which had been removed during the initial investigation, had left marks on the mountainside. Examining these marks and comparing them to the photographs from 1959, Yudin realized something. The official report's suggestion that a small avalanche or snowslide had occurred at the tent site couldn't be correct. The terrain showed no signs of avalanche activity. The slope was too shallow. Local snow patterns didn't support it. Yudin faced a decision. Should he publicly challenge the official conclusion? In the Soviet Union of the 1960s, this could have serious consequences. Challenging government reports, suggesting cover-ups, could lead to arrest or worse. But Yudin felt he owed it to his dead friends to seek truth. He began quietly sharing his doubts with journalists and researchers. Another key figure was investigator Lev Ivanov himself. For 30 years after closing the case, Ivanov said nothing publicly about his doubts. He followed orders, kept the secrets, and lived with the knowledge that the official report was inadequate. But in 1990, after the Soviet Union began to crumble and information controls loosened, Ivanov made a momentous decision. He would tell the truth. In a bombshell interview with a regional newspaper, Ivanov revealed what he had been forbidden to say in 1959. He admitted that his investigation team had seen strange lights over Dead Mountain on multiple occasions. He described them as bright, spherical, moving in ways that defied natural explanation. He revealed that he had been ordered by senior Soviet officials to suppress this information and to dismiss any theories involving military activity. Most dramatically, Ivanov admitted, "I have no doubt that something extraordinary happened on Dead Mountain. Whether it was military testing, some natural phenomenon we don't understand, or something else entirely, I cannot say.
But the official explanation, a compelling natural force, was a phrase I was ordered to use because we couldn't explain what really happened. This admission was shocking. A former senior prosecutor, admitting publicly that a major investigation had been compromised by political pressure. Ivanov's revelation opened the floodgates. Other investigators came forward with their own doubts. Witnesses who had been told to keep quiet about the strange lights began speaking publicly. In the 1990s, after the Soviet archives were partially opened, researchers gained access to the original investigation files. What they found was illuminating. Entire sections of the investigation had been removed, photographs were missing, some witness statements had been redacted or removed entirely. The original medical examiner's reports contained observations that hadn't appeared in the final report, particularly regarding the patterns of injuries and the radiation findings. One researcher, Yuri Kuntsevich, made it his life's work to investigate the case. In the early 1990s, he established the DYATLOV Foundation, dedicated to preserving documents, supporting research, and keeping the memory of the 9 victims alive. Kuntsevich made several key decisions that would shape how the case was understood. First, he organized the systematic collection and publication of all available documents, autopsy reports, photographs, maps, witness statements. Everything that hadn't been destroyed was compiled and made public. This transparency was revolutionary for a case that had been secret for 3 decades. Second, he organized scientific expeditions to the site, bringing in experts in avalanches, meteorology, forensic medicine, and other relevant fields. The goal was to test every theory systematically using modern scientific methods. Third, he established contact with the families of the victims and survivors, ensuring their voices would be heard. Many families had spent decades without answers, forbidden from speaking publicly. Now they could share their stories. These decisions made by Yudin, Ivanov, Kuntsevich and others ensured that the Dyatlov Pass incident wouldn't be forgotten, but they also set the stage for decades of theories, debates, and increasingly elaborate explanations for what had happened on Dead Mountain.
By the early 2000s, the Dyatlov Pass incident had become an international mystery. Books had been written, documentaries had been filmed. The case had spread beyond Russia to capture the imagination of mystery enthusiasts worldwide. Websites dedicated to the case catalogued every piece of evidence, every theory, every detail. But the proliferation of theories created new problems. Some were reasonable scientific hypotheses, others ventured into the realm of pure speculation, and a few were outright conspiracy theories that had no basis in evidence. The case became a kind of intellectual Rorschach test. People saw in it whatever they wanted to see. The avalanche theory received renewed attention in the 2010s when researchers began applying modern computer modeling to the question, could a rare type of avalanche, called a slab avalanche, have occurred on Dead Mountain? Traditional avalanche science said no. The slope wasn't steep enough. But new research suggested that under very specific conditions involving wind-deposited snow, a cut made in the slope like the one the hikers made to pitch their tent, and delayed settling, a slab avalanche could occur even on a shallow slope. In 2019, the Russian government, under pressure from families and researchers, officially reopened the case. Prosecutor Andrei Kuryakov led the new investigation. His team conducted extensive research, including bringing in avalanche experts from multiple countries. In 2020, they announced their conclusion. A slab avalanche had occurred, causing the deaths. But this conclusion satisfied almost no one. Critics pointed out the same problems that had existed since 1959. Where were the signs of an avalanche? How did an avalanche explain the radiation? What about the strange lights reported by witnesses? How did the timeline work? An avalanche severe enough to cause massive injuries, but gentle enough to leave the tent still partially standing. The families of the victims, now mostly elderly siblings and relatives, the parents had all passed away, rejected the conclusion. They knew their loved ones. They knew the evidence. A simple avalanche didn't explain everything. Then in 2021, scientists from Switzerland and Russia published a groundbreaking study in the journal Nature Communications. Using advanced computer modeling, analysis of snow physics, and even data from the Disney movie Frozen, which had required similar snow simulation, they proposed a detailed mechanism for how a delayed slab avalanche could have occurred. According to their model, the hikers cut into the slope to pitch their tent around 5 p.m. This cut destabilized the snow layer above them, but the avalanche didn't happen immediately. Instead, strong katabatic winds, cold air flowing down the mountain, deposited additional snow on the slope above the tent over several hours. Around midnight, the accumulated weight and stress caused a slab of snow to slide. This avalanche wouldn't have been massive, just a small section of the slope sliding forward. But according to the computer model, it would have been enough to damage the tent and possibly injure some people sleeping inside. The hikers, waking to the sound and feel of snow collapsing on them, panicked. They cut their way out and fled, fearing a much larger avalanche was coming. The model suggested that the injuries to the ravine victims occurred later, not from the initial avalanche, but from a secondary collapse while they were huddled in the ravine trying to survive.
This would explain why their injuries were so severe, despite the tent showing relatively little damage. It was an elegant theory, supported by sophisticated science. The paper made headlines worldwide. Many experts declared the DYATLOV Pass incident finally solved, but problems remained. The radiation still wasn't explained. The Swiss team admitted their model couldn't address this aspect. The strange lights reported by witnesses weren't mentioned in their study, and some forensic experts questioned whether the pattern of injuries was really consistent with avalanche trauma, even a delayed one. Moreover, some criticized the study for being too focused on fitting a model to the known facts, rather than asking whether the basic avalanche premise made sense. If the hikers feared an avalanche, why did they walk a mile down the mountain but not take basic survival equipment? Why did some try to return to the tent later if they believed it was still in danger from avalanche? By 2023, the debate had reached a kind of stalemate. There were three main camps. First, the avalanche believers, those who accepted the Swiss study's conclusions and believed the case was essentially solved with minor mysteries remaining. Second, the military theory proponents, those who believed something involving Soviet weapons testing or an accident had occurred, with the government covering it up. Third, the something else group, people who believed the evidence pointed to something outside our current understanding, whether paranormal, involving unknown natural phenomena, or something else entirely. What was clear was that 65 years after 9 hikers died on a frozen mountain, we still didn't have a universally accepted explanation. The evidence remained contradictory, the theories remained incomplete, and the families still had no real closure. The tension in the case had reached its peak. Multiple explanations existed, each with supporting evidence and each with problems. The mystery had become not just about what happened, but about whether we would ever truly know.
So what really happened on Dead Mountain on the night of February 1st, 1959? After examining all the evidence, all the theories, all the research conducted over 65 years, can we finally answer this question? Let me lay out what we know with absolute certainty. 9 experienced hikers, educated, prepared, expert mountaineers, pitched their tent on the eastern slope of Kolatsiakl. They prepared for sleep. They wrote a humorous newsletter. They were relaxed, confident, in good spirits. Nothing in their behavior that evening suggested fear or concern. Then, sometime between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., something happened. Something so terrifying, so urgent, that they cut their way out of their tent from the inside and fled into -40-degree temperatures wearing minimal clothing. This is fact, not speculation. The evidence is indisputable. They traveled approximately 1 mile down the mountain to a cedar tree. They attempted to build a fire. They broke branches from the tree, possibly trying to see back to their tent or looking for better kindling. 2 of them, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishchenko, died there from hypothermia, despite their efforts to stay warm. 3 others, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin and Igor Dyatlov, attempted to return to the tent. They made it various distances before succumbing to the cold. Their deaths were from hypothermia, but they also showed injuries, bruising, a skull fracture, internal bleeding. 4 others, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Briginoles, Semyon Zolotaryov and Lyudmila Dubinina, sought shelter in a ravine about 75 meters from the cedar tree. They built a makeshift bed of cedar branches. They took clothing from those who had already died, trying to stay warm. But 3 of them suffered massive internal injuries, crushed chests, broken ribs, fractured skulls, injuries that the medical examiner said were consistent with extreme force, and one of them, Lyudmila, was found with missing soft tissue, her tongue, her eyes, portions of her face. These are the facts. The question is, how do we connect them into a coherent explanation? The avalanche theory explains some elements well. It provides a mechanism for why they fled the tent, fear of being buried. It potentially explains the injuries in the ravine if a secondary collapse occurred there, and modern computer modeling has shown that a delayed slab avalanche was physically possible on that slope. But the avalanche theory struggles with other evidence. It doesn't explain the radiation found on clothing. It doesn't account for the strange lights seen by multiple independent witnesses. It doesn't fully explain why experienced mountaineers wouldn't recognize a small avalanche for what it was and return to their tent once the danger passed. The military testing theory explains different elements. It accounts for the radiation if there was a weapons test or accident involving radioactive materials. It explains the lights if there were missiles or other military activity in the area. It explains the Soviet government's eagerness to close the case and seal the files, a cover-up to hide a military accident. But the military theory has its own problems. If the military was involved, where is the evidence of their presence at the scene? Why were there no boot prints, no equipment, no physical traces? And what kind of weapon causes massive internal injuries without external wounds and without killing people instantly? The pattern of injuries doesn't match typical weapons effects. Here's what I believe, based on weighing all the evidence. Something did happen on Dead Mountain that night that we don't fully understand. I think the most likely core explanation is a natural phenomenon, probably related to the avalanche theory, but I also think there were other factors involved that complicated the situation and that we still don't have complete information about. I believe a snow event occurred, whether a traditional slab avalanche or some other type of snow movement. This frightened the hikers into fleeing the tent. Their panic was intensified by several factors: the complete darkness, the extreme cold, the disorientation of being woken suddenly, and possibly the sound and feel of snow moving around them. But I also think there's something to the reports of strange lights and unusual activity in the area. The military test theory, while incomplete, might explain some aspects. There might have been something else happening that night, perhaps unrelated to the hikers' deaths but contributing to their panic or to the government's subsequent handling of the case. The injuries in the ravine
ravine, I believe, were caused by a secondary event, whether another snow collapse, a fall, or something else. The pattern of injuries is unusual but not impossible in an avalanche scenario, especially if the victims were in a confined space like the ravine. The missing soft tissue, Dubinina's tongue and eyes, I believe is most likely explained by decomposition and scavenging. Her body was found in running water, which accelerates tissue breakdown. Scavenger animals preferentially consume soft tissues like eyes and tongues. While disturbing, this is a known phenomenon in bodies exposed to the elements for extended periods. The radiation remains the biggest mystery. It's possible it came from previous contamination from Krivonischenko's work. It's possible it came from something else that night. Without more information, which may no longer exist, we may never know.
What happened to the DYATLOV group matters not, because it was unique. Tragedies in the wilderness happen every year, but because it represents something deeper. The limits of human understanding, the persistence of mystery in a world we think we have fully mapped and explained. 9 people walked into a mountain wilderness and 65 years later, despite extensive investigation, despite modern science, despite countless hours of analysis, we still cannot say with absolute certainty what killed them. That uncertainty troubles us. We live in an age where we expect answers. We have technology that can map Mars, that can sequence genomes, that can simulate the formation of galaxies. Surely we should be able to explain what happened to 9 hikers on a mountain, but we can't, not completely, not in a way that addresses every piece of evidence and satisfies every question. The DYATLOV Pass incident has become more than a historical mystery. It has become a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that there are still things we don't understand. It's telling that the case generates new interest with each generation. Every few years someone proposes a new theory, applies a new technology, or uncovers a forgotten document. Each time we hope for closure. Each time we find that the mystery remains. For the families of the victims, this lack of closure has been painful. Most of the parents have now passed away, never having received a satisfactory explanation for what happened to their children. Yuri Yudin, the only survivor, spent 54 years searching for answers before his death in 2013. He visited the site dozens of times. He studied every theory. He corresponded with every researcher. And in the end, even he couldn't say with certainty what had killed his friends. But perhaps that's not the most important part of this story. Perhaps what matters most is that we remember them, not as statistics, not as victims of a mystery, but as real people who lived, who dreamed, who went on an adventure. Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, who loved engineering and wanted to design better camping equipment. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, who was planning to lead her own expeditions after graduation. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, who kept detailed journals of her hikes and wanted to write a book about her adventures someday. The 2 Yuris, Doroshenko and Krivonischenko, best friends who had hiked together for years and always made their fellow travelers laugh. Rustem Slobodin, who had literally sewn the tent they used with his own hands. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, whose mixed heritage made him unique in their group. Alexander Kolevatov, quiet and thoughtful, who documented everything. And Semyon Zolotaryov, the veteran who had survived World War II and countless other dangers, only to die on a peaceful mountain hike. These were people. They had families who loved them. They had futures that were stolen from them. Whatever happened on Dead Mountain, their memory deserves respect and their story deserves to be told accurately and completely. The case has taught us important lessons about wilderness safety, about the limits of human knowledge, and about the importance of thorough investigation. Modern hiking safety protocols have been influenced by the DYATLOV case. Search and rescue operations have learned from the mistakes made in 1959. And the scientific study of rare avalanche types has been advanced by attempts to explain what happened. In 2023, a permanent memorial was established at the site. It bears all 9 names and a simple inscription. They went into the mountains and never returned. We will remember them. The site attracts thousands of visitors each year, hikers, researchers, people drawn by the mystery. The mountain that took their lives has become a place of remembrance. Will we ever know exactly what happened? Perhaps not. Perhaps the complete truth died with the 9 hikers on that frozen mountain. But the search for answers continues. New technologies are applied to old evidence. New theories are proposed. New witnesses come forward with information. Just this year, previously unreleased photographs from one of the victims' cameras were made public, showing the final moments before they set up camp. Researchers are still analyzing these images, looking for any clue they might have missed for 65 years. The DYATLOV Pass incident reminds us that mystery still exists in our world, that there are still questions without answers, that sometimes, despite our best efforts, despite all our science and technology, the truth remains elusive. But it also reminds us of something else, that the search for truth matters, that we owe it to those who came before us to keep asking questions, keep investigating, keep refusing to accept easy answers that don't account for all the evidence. 9 experienced hikers died on Dead Mountain in February 1959. We may never know exactly why, but we will never stop asking, and we will never forget them.